You ever come across anything that is so frustrating and so contradictory in its hypocrisy that it just literally sends you into a spiral of depression to where you want to do nothing but just completely shut down and just let the whole world just pass right over you? That's the way I feel with having to address nonsense like this by this blogger who goes by the name Eve's Daughter. Because it just goes to show the absolute extremes that these fraudulent feminists or these mouth-breathing hypocrite frauds who erroneously and undeservedly wear the mantle of feminism as though that were their cape of protection to allow them to say the most outlandish and outrageous things that they can possibly hope to get away with in their unyielding drive to demonize men and males. But if you really want to see just how well women of this mindset really care about women, talk to Toni Morrison's daughter. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Anyway, let me continue trying to answer these often flip-flopping, often contradictory list of identifiers, which are supposedly to help uncover that a man is a supporter of the crime of rape. And based upon how all of these sentences are structured and how many of them there are and how they often contradict one another, it's plain to clearly see that what this wicked witch is actually intending on doing is to leave absolutely no space unpatched to allow any man to escape through it. Her whole determination is to eventually establish that every single male in existence is a supporter of the crime of rape. So picking up where I left off earlier, the next identifier which she lists. Now this one's classic. He ever subordinates the interests of women in a given population to the interests of the men in that population. Now notice her curious wording here. She talks about comparing the interest of men versus the interest of women, quote, in a given population, unquote. And see, I don't think she realizes exactly what she did when she included that little caveat phrase there. Because let's just consider an instance where the males of a given population will focus more on the interest of the males in that given population over the females of that given population. Let's say that the given population, to broadly expand on the definition of the term, is a male-dominated social club or some sort, such as, say, a country club, where clearly the vast majority of the numbers of those who are involved in this, if you will, given population are going to be largely men. And so, naturally, whatever interests there are that are going to be related to that particular social fraternity or sports club or whatever, they're naturally going to put the greater concern and the greater interest of men ahead of those of women, mainly because women will comprise the greater minority, to use an oxymoron. Let's use a more rational example. Let's say that our given population is a neighborhood association, to where if you want to live in a particular neighborhood or if you want to own a condominium in a specific subdivision, that you agree to abide by certain rules and guidelines. And as being part of that select population, then whatever changes or improvements or issues of concern are going to be geared primarily, if not exclusively, to the interests of the homeowners of those neighborhoods or of those condominium units. So to use as a real life example, when I worked at a condominium, they had signs posted which stated clearly that outsiders are not permitted to walk their dogs through our open spaces, which a lot of people on the outside would have loved to have done because there was a lot of open space where they could just go take their animals, let them do their business or whatever, just walk past through the serenity of the area or some mess. But because the interest of the condominium owners supersedes the interest of anybody else who is not an owner or a renter within that condominium, they had to abide by that restriction. And we would tell them in no uncertain terms, don't let your dog walk through here. Don't let your dog do his business here. Don't veg out on any of our park benches. Don't hold your little barbecues over here using our equipment. If you want those perks and those privileges, buy or rent a unit here. Now, were we wrong for saying that? Were we wrong for not taking their interest into account or not catering to their interest simply because of the fact that they were not considered to be on the same level as someone who actually lived at the units. So if there's a reason for denying someone the exact same privileges of another group based on, quote, being part of a given population, unquote, then a similar principle applies. If there are, quote, given populations, unquote, which do not focus too heavily on the interest of women over the interest of men, then what is it about the structure of those given populations which make it so? And could there be some justification behind it? And I'll give you another real-life example, one on a much grander scale. Within the nation of Kenya, there exists a village which was established independently and run exclusively by and for women. The village consists of a number of women who had been ostracized from their original village homes by their husbands, no less, for various infractions as their dim-witted husbands perceived them to be, including the greatest shame of primitive thinking, which is the idea that when a woman is sexually assaulted and raped, that by her becoming a victim of such a heinous crime, she is the one who brings shame and dishonor to the family. Such primitive, backwards thinking, which exists unfortunately in wide swaths of the world. So if you want to complain about something, there's something legitimate you can actually complain about that does relate directly to the crime of rape. But these women having absolutely no sort of redress whatsoever, no one to hear their concerns, no one to give them any sympathy or compassion or any support, rather than the men of the village of these victims actually going out and killing some MFer who would actually do such a thing to their wives and their daughters, instead make them outcasts of their own village. And so the women seeing no other alternative but to establish their own exclusively female village, the only males granted any sort of a presence whatsoever within their village community are the sons that they're raising as ostracized wives and mothers, and the landlord, who typically doesn't stick around very long under threat of some sort of possible physical confrontation. So even he's received with limited amounts of toleration. The women of Umoja village do not play around. So now, since the village is clearly an example of a, quote, given population, unquote, then would it be fair to blame them or to accuse them of having anti-male criminal tendencies or engaging in anti-male criminal behavior or supporters of any anti-male criminal activity simply because of the fact that they will promote and give priority to the interests of the women within that population? So as a frothing-mouthed phony feminist, you would see the logic in the idea that any decisions or any discussions or any interests that they have about or in relation to their given population of all females are, one, to be expected, and two, to be treated as legitimate issues and concerns without forethought of malice. But being a disingenuous harpy shrew, as most of you fraudulent feminists are, while you would excuse that as being legitimate and worthy of support, or at least having a positive spin put upon it, you would deny men of a given population where issues are going to be more heavily related toward them and their needs, such as, let's say, for instance, a coal mining site. Not too many women work the coal mines. Not too many women work construction sites or do iron work, building skyscrapers and suspension bridges and things of this sort. And to my knowledge, there are no women who are part of Special Forces military units, whether we're talking Navy SEALs or Army Rangers or what have you. And in such instances, the interests and the concerns of men are going to take precedence. It's only natural, and it's only logical, and it's only reasonable. But the second part of your question seems to suggest that you have broader implications in mind, where you say if they proceed in discussions as if the interests of the women are the same as the interests of the men. And here too you're wrong, because generally speaking, the interests of men and women are equivalent. They are virtually the same. They are practically identical. There are going to be some specific exceptions here and there. But as a general rule, as human beings, we have many of the same shared and mutually compatible interests. Not to say that there can't be room for adjustment and improvement. Take, for instance, sports stadiums. Now that women are becoming more and more involved in spectator sports, the female anatomy being what it is, and the extra steps that they usually have to take in order to do their business, as far as relieving themselves and cleaning up after themselves, it makes perfect sense to have at least 3 additional toilet facilities for every 1 male toilet facility. Because as men, we generally just whip our stuff out, bleed it out, and then take off and free an empty space for the next guy to come in behind us. We're in, we're out, we're done. See, we don't have to go through all those extra motions such as maxi pads or tampons, freshen up wipes, or things of this sort. We don't wear layer and layer upon clothing. So we don't have to tangle with dresses and skirts and pantyhose and all these other inconveniences. And so because women's dress and women's bodily functions are actually more complicated and more involved, it would make sense to set aside additional facilities in order to meet those needs. It's only fair and it's only logical. So that would be an instance in which the interest of the women were given greater consideration. And I don't think you would find any man out there who would complain about that. But see, what often gets overlooked, though, is the legitimate complaints that men have where things are supposed to be equal, or we're always hearing women complaining about how things are not equal, how things are not fair for women. And yet when we get involved in situations where we actually demand equality, then all of a sudden women want to turn correction. These fake, phony feminists want to turn it right around and talk about how, once again, you're putting too much of an unfair burden on the women if you have them to be held to the same standards as you have of the men. Case in point, for all their braggadociousness about how women serve in the military too, how many women are actually out there on the front lines, or how many of them are actually in infantry units? Or let's not even talk about actual service in the military. Let's talk about registering for the draft, or as they pretty it up to try to make it sound more appealing, selective service. When you turn 18 years old, you have to register for selective service. Otherwise, you can't get any sort of government aid for education. You can't get any sort of a work in the government field. You can't qualify for any sort of government loans, but only if you're rocking a penis. If you were born with a little pink slit between your legs, you're exempt. So here's more of that two-facedness that we have to deal with. Like whatever's good for a man is good for a woman too, until it puts an equal burden on the shoulders of the women. Then suddenly all bets are off. And this is also true about seemingly little things. For instance, how many men's bathrooms do you know of which have a little lounge area? Or here's one that should really warm your heart. I don't know if they're still doing this to this day or not, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are. But when I was attending Lawrence High School in Lawrence, Kansas, and for the entire time that I had lived in Lawrence, Kansas, up until the time I got divorced and moved to Texas, all of the boys' restrooms, every single one of them, had toilet stations without privacy stalls. Not a single one of them. Yet you go into any of the girls' restrooms, which I had done, because I wanted to see for myself if there was any consistency throughout the school. The girls' restrooms had all the privacy stalls that you could hope to install, which is really ass backwards when you think about it, because we know how girls do. They all like to go to the restroom together. When men gotta go take care of their business, we like our privacy, and yet that was stripped away from the boys in Lawrence High School. But had they taken out all the stalls out of all the girls' restrooms, just for the sake of consistency, or to make the declaration that no one was going to be treated special, that everyone had to deal with equal inconvenience, I don't even have to say what would have happened. You already know. So again, more of this fraudulent feminist disingenuousness and inconsistency just shows what the true agenda really is. It's not about fairness. It's not about equality. It's not even about making sure that each one's interests are focused upon in any proper light. It's all about elevating women and de-elevating men, plain and simple. And you will fabricate anything in order to do just that. Out of time for this one. I'll be back. Talented 10th.